Everyone in Cutter's Creek, Wyoming told Winifred Townsend the same thing in the same breath, that Henry Sutton was a man carved from granite and winter frost, a widower who had buried his heart alongside his wife 3 years past, and had not once looked up from the dark soil since. Winifred heard it first from Mrs. Davenport, the postmistress, who pressed the advertisement across the wooden counter with 2 fingers, as though she were delivering a verdict rather than a piece of paper. The advertisement had been printed in the St. Louis Dispatch in the spring of 1878, placed under the modest heading of matrimonial arrangements, and it read with the terse efficiency of a man who did not believe in wasting ink. Rancher, 34, Wyoming Territory, 2 children, seeks woman of sound character and willing temperament. Letters only, H. Sutton, Box 7, Cutter's Creek. That was all, no mention of companionship. No softening language about warmth or shared evenings by the fire. No promises of a good home, though Winifred supposed a working ranch qualified as one. Just the bare bones of a transaction dressed up in the modest clothing of matrimonial correspondence. Winifred was 27, which in St. Louis in 1878 meant that she existed in a peculiar social purgatory, where she was too old to be considered a fresh prospect, and too young to be left entirely in peace by well-meaning aunts. Her father had passed 2 winters ago, leaving her a small bookshop that barely earned enough to heat itself through January. Her mother had remarried a man named Gerald Finch, who smelled of hair pomade and disapproval, and who made it quietly but unmistakably clear that Winifred's continued residence in the family home was a matter of increasing inconvenience. She had never been what St. Louis would call beautiful, though she had been called handsome by people she trusted and plain by people she did not. She was tall for a woman, with dark brown hair that refused to hold a curl and gray eyes that her father had called the color of the Missouri River on a cloudy afternoon. She read too much and spoke too directly and laughed too loudly for parlor society, and she had reached the conclusion, sitting in her father's bookshop on a rainy April evening, that she was not made for the kind of life that St. Louis was offering her. She looked at the advertisement for 3 days before she wrote her first letter. She did not write it the way she imagined most women wrote such letters, careful and demure, presenting their best qualities in gentle watercolor strokes. Winifred Townsend wrote letters the way she talked, which was to say directly and with considerable honesty, and the first letter she sent to Box 7, Cutter's Creek, Wyoming Territory, was 4 pages long. She told him she was 27 and had never married, not because no one had asked, but because she had said no twice to men she did not respect, and once to a man she liked well enough but could not quite love. She told him she had managed a bookshop for 2 years following her father's death, and that she could keep accounts and argue a fair price, and was not afraid of hard work. She told him she was not a particularly skilled cook, but that she was a fast learner and a willing one. She told him she had a habit of reading late into the night, and a tendency to form strong opinions on subjects that women were not generally expected to have opinions about. She told him she understood what she was considering, a long journey into unfamiliar territory to build a life beside a man she had never met, and that she did not consider this something to be undertaken lightly or falsely, and that she would rather they know something true about each other before she made any decision at all. She signed it simply, Winifred Townsend, St. Louis, Missouri. She mailed it on a Tuesday and spent the next 2 weeks trying to convince herself she was not waiting for a reply. She was, of course, waiting with the kind of quiet desperation that polite women were trained to disguise as patience. What she did not know, and would not know for some time, was what happened in the kitchen of the Sutton Ranch on the evening the letter arrived. Henry Sutton had been splitting firewood when Tom Greer, his foreman and the closest thing he had to a friend in the world, came out from the house holding a letter between 2 fingers with a carefully neutral expression that told Henry immediately that it was one of the matrimonial responses. He had placed that advertisement in 4 papers 3 months ago at the insistence of his sister, Margaret, who lived in Cheyenne, and wrote him letters full of practical love and gentle alarm about his children, Clara and James, who were 9 and 7 respectively, and growing up in a house that ran on efficiency and silence. Henry set down his axe. He was a large man, broad through the shoulder, with hands that had been shaped by 15 years of ranch work into something that looked more like tools than appendages. His hair was dark and shot through at the temples with early gray. His face was the kind of face that had once been open and had learned, through grief, to keep its own counsel. He was not cold, though nearly everyone who had known him since his wife Alina's death would have said so without hesitation. He was simply a man who had poured everything he had into grieving and come out the other side emptied, and uncertain how to fill himself back up. He had received 11 letters in response to the advertisement. He had read 9 of them with the polite but distant attention of a man reviewing livestock assessments, and had written brief, courteous replies declining to proceed. 2 he had not answered at all, which shamed him, but he had not known what to say to women who seemed to want something from him that he was not certain he possessed any more. He carried Winifred Townsend's letter inside. He sat down at the kitchen table. He unfolded it. He read the first paragraph and felt something shift, barely, the way ground shifts before water finds its way through stone. He read the second paragraph and his hands settled more firmly on the paper. By the third page, his elbows were on the table, and his head was bowed over the words as though he were reading scripture. And when he reached the final page and her careful, direct signature, he realized that his eyes had gone wet. He sat very still for a long moment, surprised at himself, because he had not cried since the night Alina died and had believed, with the flat certainty of a man who has walked a long way through cold, that he had lost the ability to do it. But this woman, this Winifred Townsend who said she had refused men she didn't respect and was a poor cook but a fast learner, and who wanted something true between them before she made any decision. This woman had walked through 4 pages of ink and reached him somewhere he had not expected to be reachable. He folded the letter carefully and held it a moment before putting it in his breast pocket. Then he got up and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the window looking out at the wide Wyoming sky going orange and purple at the edges as the sun set behind the Laramie Range, and he tried to figure out what in the world he was supposed to do with the feeling she had left behind in his chest. He wrote back that same night. He was not a natural writer. His sentences were short and sometimes clumsy, and he crossed words out and rewrote them 3 times before he was satisfied. But he wrote 2 full pages, and he told her things he had not told another person in 3 years. He told her about Clara and James. Clara, who was solemn and precise like her mother and loved horses with a single-minded devotion, and James, who was reckless and loud, and tender-hearted beneath it all, and who still sometimes climbed into Henry's bed at night after a bad dream without saying a word. He told her the ranch was called the Sutton Creek Ranch and covered 400 acres in the eastern Wyoming foothills, and that it ran cattle and a few horses, and that the nearest town was Cutter's Creek, 9 miles east. He told her that Wyoming winters were not gentle things, and that the work of a ranch was not gentle either, and that he would not have her come under false pretenses. Then, after a long pause in which he stared at the candle flame for what must have been 10 minutes, he wrote one more sentence. "Your letter was the most honest thing I have read in 3 years, and I find that I am not as indifferent to honest things as I had supposed." He signed it, Henry Sutton. He sealed it and gave it to Tom to post in the morning before he could reconsider. Winifred received it on a Thursday afternoon, standing at the counter of the bookshop, while a customer browsed the philosophy section. She read it standing up, which she would later tell him was the only way she read important things, and when she reached the final sentence, she pressed the letter against her sternum and closed her eyes and breathed. She wrote back the same evening, and so began something that neither of them had names for yet. Through May and into June, The letters crossed the distance between St. Louis and Wyoming like a private telegraph line strung over mountains and prairie, and each letter went a little deeper than the last. Winifred wrote about her father, about the way he had filled the bookshop with noise and philosophy and laughter, and how the silence after his death had been a physical thing she had moved through like weather. Henry wrote about Eleanor, not in the careful, reverent way that grief is usually performed in public, but in the real way, how she had been stubborn and funny, and had a habit of finishing his sentences in entirely the wrong direction, and how some mornings he still reached to her side of the bed before he was fully awake, and then spent the rest of the day carrying the small stone of that reaching. Winifred told him she was afraid of being a poor stepmother, of coming into two children's lives and being an intruder where she wanted to be a comfort. Henry told her that Clara had looked at the most recent photograph of his sister Margaret and declared her dress ridiculous, and that James had asked whether the woman who might come to live with them would be able to teach him to read better, because his teacher, Miss Aldrich, had a tendency to rap knuckles, and he felt this was counterproductive. Winifred laughed at that, a real laugh, full and unguarded, and wrote back that she was quite certain she could teach James to read without rapping his knuckles, as she had been surrounded by books her entire life, and considered knuckle rapping an offense against the very spirit of literature. By late June, Henry was waiting for her letters with an impatience that he recognized and did not quite know what to do with. By early July, Winifred had begun, quietly and without announcing it to herself, to think of Wyoming as a destination rather than an abstraction. It was Tom Greer who noticed the change in Henry first. Tom was 42, lean and weathered, with a slow drawl and eyes that missed nothing, and he had worked for Henry for 6 years through drought and rustlers and Eleanor's illness and the terrible year after, and he knew Henry Sutton the way you know country you have walked in all weather. He noticed that Henry had begun humming while he worked, not consciously, just under his breath, a tuneless kind of sound that was the sonic equivalent of a man who has been very cold for a long time beginning to realize he might be warming up. He noticed that the kitchen table, which had been bare and functional for 3 years, now had a small stack of folded letters in the corner, kept with the kind of careful arrangement that meant they were being reread. He did not say anything, which was one of Tom's finest qualities. Clara noticed, too, in the precise and watchful way of a 9-year-old who has had to pay very close attention to the adults in her world since losing her mother. She asked her father one evening while he was brushing down her mare, a gray pony called Silver that Clara loved with the devotion of a small priest, whether the woman who answered the advertisement was nice. Henry paused in his brushing and looked at his daughter, who was watching him with Eleanor's eyes, steady and direct. He considered lying or deflecting, and then remembered that he had decided 3 years ago that his children deserved his honesty even when it was imprecise. "I think she might be," he said. "Does she like horses?" Clara asked. Henry wrote Winifred that same night and asked, somewhat abruptly and in the middle of a sentence about cattle prices, whether she liked horses. Winifred wrote back that she had limited experience with horses, having grown up in a city, but that she was prepared to form an entirely positive opinion of them given sufficient introduction, and that she would consider it an honor to be judged worthy by whatever horses were doing the judging. Henry read that paragraph aloud to Clara at breakfast, and Clara was silent for a moment and then said, "She's funny," with the tone of someone conceding a point they had not expected to concede. James, who had been listening while pretending to be absorbed in his oatmeal, looked up and said, "Does she know any stories?" And Henry, who was discovering that Winifred Townsend had begun to occupy a significant portion of his daily thoughts, wrote that afternoon to ask. Her answer arrived 10 days later and took up an entire page, listing with great enthusiasm the various genres of story available to a woman who had spent her formative years in a bookshop, ranging from fairy tales to adventure serials to the Greek myths, which she considered underrated for children, and the Arabian Nights, which she considered perhaps appropriately rated but absolutely irresistible. James, upon hearing portions read aloud, Henry had taken to reading them at the dinner table now, an act of such unprecedented domesticity that Tom Greer made no comment whatsoever, declared that she sounded excellent, and that he hoped she came soon. Henry looked at his son's earnest face across the oilcloth table, and felt the thing in his chest that he had been carrying carefully for months rise up and present itself with a kind of quiet insistence that he could no longer pretend was merely polite interest. He wrote to Winifred that night and asked her if she would consider coming to Wyoming. He wrote the letter 3 times before he got it right. The first version was too businesslike, laying out the practical arrangements with the careful detachment of a man negotiating a contract. The second version went too far in the other direction and revealed things that seemed, in the cold light of a reread, too exposed for a man who had only known this woman through letters. The third version found the balance honest and direct, as she herself had been from the beginning, and he told her that her letters had made him look forward to mornings in a way he had not for some time, and that his children were increasingly curious about her, and that he believed, carefully and without pressure, that they had the foundation of something worth exploring in person. He did not tell her that he had wept reading her first letter. He was not yet sure how to say that, or whether it needed saying. But he sealed the letter and posted it, and then went out to the south pasture, and stood in the tall grass with the Wyoming sky vast and indifferent above him and breathed. Winifred received his letter on a Wednesday. She sat in the back room of the bookshop surrounded by shelves of other people's worlds and read it twice, and then she set it down and looked at the middle distance for a considerable while, and then she picked it up and read it a third time. She told herself she was going to think about it carefully and rationally. She wrote back the next morning and said yes. The practical arrangements took the better part of 6 weeks. There was the matter of the bookshop, which she sold, for less than it was worth, as such things tend to go, to a young man named Arthur Pell, who had worked as her assistant for a year, and loved the place with the fervor of the converted. There was the matter of her mother and Gerald Finch, who received the news with expressions that Winifred chose to interpret as concern, though she was fairly certain relief played a considerable part. There was the matter of packing her life into 2 trunks, which forced her to reckon with how much of her life was books, and the answering question of how many books were strictly reasonable to transport to Wyoming territory by rail, which she resolved by packing as many as would fit and reclassifying them as strictly reasonable. She wrote Henry a letter the week before she left and told him she was coming. She told him she was bringing books. She told him she was frightened in the way that any reasonable person was frightened by the unknown, but that she had decided some time ago that fear was not a sufficient reason to stop doing things, and that she believed in the possibility of what they might be building, and that she intended to arrive with an open heart and a willingness to be proven either right or wonderfully wrong. Henry read that letter standing in the middle of the kitchen while the biscuits burned because he had forgotten to attend to them, and Tom Greer came in from the yard and looked at the smoke and then at Henry's expression and said, very calmly, "I'll handle the biscuits." Winifred boarded the Union Pacific Railroad at St. Louis on the 15th of September, 1878. The journey to Laramie took 3 days, and from Laramie she would take the stage northwest to Cutter's Creek. She had never been this far west before. The landscape changed outside the train window like a conversation, moving from the familiar to the extraordinary, the flat richness of Missouri farmland giving way to the widening sky of Kansas, and then the swell and roll of the Nebraska prairie, and then something happening to the world that she could only describe as an expansion, as though the universe had taken a breath and held it, and the Rockies appearing on the western horizon like a revelation no one had mentioned would be this beautiful. She arrived in Laramie tired and dusty, and more excited than she had words for. The stage to Cutter's Creek took half a day over roads that made their various objections to her spine known in considerable detail. She sat with her face at the window the whole way, watching Wyoming go past her, the sagebrush flats, the cottonwood creek beds, the far hills in the mid-morning light, and she felt, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, as though she were coming toward something rather than leaving something behind. Henry Sutton was waiting at the stage depot in Cutter's Creek with his 2 children and Tom Greer, who stood slightly apart with his hat in his hands, and the careful expression of a man who understands his role in a significant scene. Winifred stepped down from the stage and saw him. She had constructed Henry Sutton in her mind through the medium of his letters, and the single photograph he had sent, a formal studio portrait in which he stood very straight and looked as though he had been told smiling was optional, and had elected not to exercise the option. He was taller than she had imagined, and broader, and the Wyoming light was doing things to the planes of his face that the photographer had entirely failed to capture. He was wearing a clean work shirt and his best hat, and he had clearly made an effort, which she found unexpectedly touching. He was watching her with an expression that was careful and guarded and entirely overwhelmed beneath the carefulness. The way a man looks when something he has been quietly hoping for is suddenly, irrevocably real. She walked toward him because someone had to walk toward someone, and she stopped about 3 feet away and looked at him and said, "I'm Winifred Townsend." "I know," he said, and his voice was lower and quieter than she had imagined, and she noticed that his hands were clenched at his sides with the specific tension of a man working very hard to be still. "I'm glad you came." "So am I," she said, and she meant it with every part of herself. Clara was standing slightly behind her father's elbow, watching with those steady dark eyes, and James had given up all pretense of composure and was examining her with the open appraisal of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to be subtle. "Did you bring the books?" James asked. Winifred turned to him and crouched down to his level, which was something she had read in a story once and decided was a mark of respect. "I brought 2 trunks," she said. "One of them is mostly books." James looked at her with an expression of profound personal satisfaction. "I knew you would," he said. Clara said nothing, but she was watching Winifred with an assessment in her eyes that was not hostile, exactly, but was thorough. Winifred met her gaze and held it without flinching and gave her a small nod, the kind of nod that acknowledged they both understood this was a complex situation and were both prepared to approach it with the seriousness it deserved. Something in Clara's expression softened, very slightly. Tom Greer stepped forward and touched his hat and said, "Miss Townsend. Welcome to Wyoming territory. I'm Tom. I work the ranch with Mr. Sutton. Can I help with your trunks?" "Tom's spoken of highly in Henry's letters," Winifred said, and Tom looked sideways at Henry with an expression that managed to be simultaneously surprised and enormously pleased. Henry picked up her traveling bag from where the driver had deposited it and said, "The wagon's just along here," in the slightly stiff voice of a man who has excellent manners and is currently using every one of them to keep his composure. They walked together to the wagon, and the day was clear and cool and smelled of sage and dry grass, and the mountains to the west were perfectly, improbably beautiful, and Winifred walked beside Henry Sutton for the first time in her life and felt something settle in her chest like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. The ride to the ranch took a little over an hour. Tom drove, with James beside him asking questions about horses with the inexhaustible energy of a child who has identified a captive audience. Clara sat in the wagon bed with Winifred and Henry, properly arranged, and was quiet, though her eyes moved from her father to Winifred and back with a regularity that suggested active processing. Henry and Winifred talked. They talked about the landscape, which Winifred admired with such genuine enthusiasm that Henry found himself seeing it through her eyes and finding it remarkable in ways familiarity had obscured. They talked about the ranch, and he told her about the layout and the cattle and the rhythm of the work, and she asked questions that were intelligent and specific, and he realized, not for the first time, that this was a woman who prepared. "You studied up on ranching before you came," he said. "I read 3 books on the subject," she said, "and a pamphlet published by the Wyoming Livestock Commission, which was less elegantly written but more practical." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a full smile. She would learn in the weeks ahead that Henry Sutton's smiles were constructed slowly, like good architecture, and had earned them accordingly, but it was a beginning. The ranch came into view around a bend in the road, and Winifred sat up straighter in the wagon bed. It was bigger than she had imagined from his descriptions. The main house was sturdy and low, built from timber and stone, with a long porch and 2 cottonwood trees in the yard that were shedding their early autumn gold into the dry grass. There were outbuildings, a barn and a bunkhouse and a smokehouse, and the pastures ran out behind to the south and west in long golden waves. Beyond it all, the foothills rose blue and sage-gray against the sky. "It's beautiful," Winifred said, and she was not being polite. Henry looked at the ranch the way a man looks at a thing he has spent so long working and worrying over that he has nearly forgotten to see it. "It's a working place," he said. "It can be both," Winifred said. He looked at her then, a long, direct look, and she met it, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the wagon creaked and the horses blew through their noses, and the whole of the Wyoming afternoon held still. The first days were a careful negotiation, a kind of domestic diplomacy that Winifred approached with the same practical honesty she had brought to their correspondence. She was shown to the room that had been prepared for her, a small, clean room at the east end of the house that got the morning light, and which someone, she suspected Margaret Sutton's influence through correspondence, had furnished with a blue quilt and a small vase of dried flowers that was the sweetest thing she had encountered since leaving St. Louis. She unpacked her trunks with Clara watching from the doorway, arms folded, not hostile but not yet open, and Winifred unpacked her books one by one and arranged them on the small shelf against the wall, and when she reached the Arabian Nights she held it up without turning around and said, "This one is James's, if he wants it." Clara's silence behind her took on a different quality. "What about me?" she said. Winifred turned then. "What do you like?" she asked. Clara considered this for a moment. "Horses," she said. "Then I have something for you too," Winifred said, and found 2 books down in the trunk. A copy of an illustrated natural history of horses published in 1873 that she had brought specifically because Henry had written about Clara's devotion to her gray pony. And the look on Clara's face when she received it was not the open joy of a child who is easily moved but the deep, contained pleasure of a child who does not give her responses lightly, which was somehow better. The kitchen was a challenge. Winifred had not lied about her cooking. She could make a creditable pot of coffee and a reasonable biscuit if the stars aligned, but the full scope of ranch cooking, the quantities required, the relentlessness of it, the cast-iron logic of a wood-burning stove with opinions of its own, was a study she undertook with the same determined focus she had brought to the pamphlet on Wyoming livestock. Mrs. Greer, Tom's wife Ruth, who lived in the small house at the edge of the property and came twice weekly to help with larger tasks, was patient and specific in her instruction, and did not make Winifred feel foolish for not knowing things she had never had occasion to learn. Henry watched all of this from the periphery with a careful attention that he distributed as inconspicuously as possible. He watched her learn the stove. He watched her sit with James at the kitchen table after supper working through reading exercises with a patience and creativity that had James reading aloud passages from the Arabian Nights within the first week, his small face flushed with the pride of comprehension. He watched her with Clara, who warmed slowly and genuinely, as all real things warm, and who by the end of the second week was showing Winifred how to approach Silver the pony without startling her, directing this process with the gravity of a professor and the suppressed pride of someone discovering they have knowledge worth sharing. He did not tell her how he watched her. He was not sure yet how to say such things, or whether it was appropriate to say them to a woman who was living in his house on the basis of a correspondence and a conversation on a wagon ride, No promises made, no formal agreement beyond the understanding that they were finding out. But he brought her the best cup of coffee in the morning, which she drank standing at the porch railing looking east, and he made sure the wood box in her room was always full. And once, when she came in from an attempt to assist with some minor fence repair, and was muddy to the knee and laughing at herself, he handed her a clean towel and held her gaze for just a beat longer than strictly necessary, and she looked back at him with those gray Missouri River eyes and a warmth in them that he had been reading for 3 weeks and was beginning to understand. The community of Cutter's Creek had opinions, as small communities do. Mrs. Davenport at the post office was enthusiastic and kind. The Reverend Cole and his wife were welcoming in the earnest way of people who genuinely believe in second chances and are glad to see evidence of them. Dr. Fielding, who served the whole area and had known Henry since his early ranching days, shook Winifred's hand at her first Sunday service and said, "Good to see that man getting some color back," which was candid enough to make her laugh. There were others, of course, who were less generous. Mrs. Caldwell and her sister Mrs. Price, who occupied the opinion-forming seats of any frontier community with the comfort of long practice, were audible on the subject of mail-order arrangements in general, and this one in particular. Winifred overheard fragments on her second visit to town, something about whether it was suitable for a man of Henry's standing to import a woman from the city who knew nothing about ranch life and was getting on in years besides, and felt the familiar sting of other people's assessments. She told Henry about it that evening. They were sitting on the porch after the children were in bed, which had become a nightly habit without either of them deciding it would be so, and the air was September cool and full of stars in quantities that still astonished her after 3 weeks of them. Henry was quiet for a moment after she told him. Then he said, "Mrs. Caldwell has opinions about most things and has been wrong about most of them for as long as I've known her." He paused. "You don't have to pay any mind to it." "I don't intend to," Winifred said. "I'm just reporting it. I believe in reporting things accurately." He looked at her then, and in the starlight his expression was something she had not seen on him yet, a directness that went beneath his usual careful courtesy. "You've been doing that since your first letter," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want you to keep doing it," he said, "whatever you think. Whatever bothers you or interests you." Or he stopped, and she could see him working for the words the same way she had imagined him working at his letters, crossing out and rewriting. "I want you to tell me." "I will," she said, "as long as you do the same." There was a pause, and then he said in a voice that was quiet and somewhat careful, "I've been meaning to tell you something." She waited. "Your first letter," he said, "the one you wrote in April." When I read it, he stopped again, and she realized his jaw had tightened and that he was pushing through something. "I want you to know that he exhaled. "I hadn't felt much of anything for a long time, 3 years. And I read what you wrote about honesty, and about not wanting to come under false pretenses, and about wanting something true between strangers and I." He stopped a third time, and in the starlight she could see the brightness in his eyes, and she understood what he was not quite finishing. She thought of his letter back to her, the one that had said, "Your letter was the most honest thing I have read in 3 years." She thought of the careful way he had held her gaze on the wagon ride. She thought of 3 weeks of morning coffee and evening porches, and his hands always knowing exactly where she might need something before she asked. "Henry," she said gently. "It made me cry," he said, with the flat forthrightness of a man who has decided to say the exact true thing, "which I had not done since Alina died. I did not know until that moment that I was still capable of it." She was very still. The stars burned overhead. A coyote called somewhere far out across the dark pasture. "I'm glad I wrote it," she said. "I'm very glad you read it." They sat together in the night quiet for a long time after that, and when she finally went inside she lay in her blue-quilted room and listened to the Wyoming dark, and felt the shape of what was happening between them with a clarity and tenderness that kept her awake until the small hours, not from anxiety, but from something that was almost joy. October came rolling in on a northwest wind that meant business, and with it came the intensifying rhythms of ranch work before winter. The last cattle drive to the fall markets, the laying in of supplies, the winterizing of everything that stood between the living and the Wyoming cold. Henry worked from before dawn until after dark, and Winifred worked beside him in the ways available to her, which expanded week by week as her competence grew. She had become, through determined application, a reasonably proficient ranch cook, which Ruth Greer attributed to stubbornness, and which Winifred attributed to the same. She had learned to handle a wagon with sufficient confidence to make the supply runs to Cutter's Creek, which she undertook with James riding alongside her, pointing out points of interest along the 9 miles with the authority of a miniature tour guide. She had learned enough about cattle to be useful at the edges of the work, and enough about the horses to have earned a cautious and mutual respect with the working stock, and an actual friendship with Silver the pony, who Clara had introduced her to with the formal gravity of an official presentation. In the evenings, the 4 of them had fallen into a rhythm that had the quality of something built rather than something found. Henry would come in from the work, and Winifred would have supper on, and they would eat and the children would talk about their days, and afterward she would read to them. James had graduated from the Arabian Nights to adventure serials, and Clara, to her own surprised delight, was working through the natural history of horses and cross-referencing it with questions about Silver's actual behavior, which Winifred answered by helping her write up small field notes in a composition book that Clara treated as a scientific document. Then the children went to bed, and she and Henry sat on the porch or by the kitchen fire depending on the weather, and they talked. They talked about everything. About the ranch and its future, about Clara's education and James's reading, and whether it was worth the long trip to Laramie for a better school. About a leaner, gently and honestly, in the way that healthy grief moves not the constant pressing wound of early loss but the considered, tender memory of something real and finished. About Winifred's father and the bookshop and St. Louis and what she had left and what she hadn't. About the world beyond Wyoming, the railroad expanding, the territories pushing toward statehood, the way the West was changing year by year into something new that old hands watched with complicated feelings. Henry talked more than he had talked in years, which Tom Greer noted with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose patient hope has been proven right, and which Henry himself noted with a kind of startled wonder, as though he had walked into a room he had forgotten he owned. One evening in mid-October he asked her, in the careful voice he used when he was saying something important, what she thought about staying. She looked at him across the kitchen table where the lamp was burning between them and said, "I've been thinking of very little else." He nodded slowly, the way he processed things. "I know that what I'm asking," he began. "You're asking if I'll marry you," she said, because she believed in saying the exact true thing. "Yes," he said. "I'll marry you, Henry," she said. His whole face changed. It was not a dramatic change. Henry Sutton was not a man of dramatic expressions, but it was complete and real, and she watched it happen with a feeling in her chest like summer arriving. They were married on the first Saturday of November, 1878, at the Cutter's Creek Church with Reverend Cole officiating, and approximately 30 people present, which represented most of the available population within riding distance. Tom Greer stood up with Henry, and Ruth Greer helped Winifred dress in the blue wool gown she had made herself in the weeks prior, with Clara providing serious oversight of the button fastening. James wore his good shirt and his boots and stood beside his father with an expression of tremendous importance, and Clara stood beside Winifred with flowers from Ruth's dried garden in her hands and eyes that were bright and a little wet, which she managed with the same contained intensity she brought to everything. Mrs. Davenport cried openly, which she would deny afterward. Dr. Fielding said afterward that it was the best use of a Saturday he had seen in years. Even Mrs. Caldwell, who attended with the expression of someone reserving judgment, could not entirely suppress the fact that Winifred Townsend made a handsome bride who held herself like a woman who knew where she was and had chosen it freely. Henry held her hand through the entire ceremony and did not let go of it until after the ring was on. When Reverend Cole said the words and they were made to each other, Henry looked at her with those careful gray eyes that had learned to be still, and she looked at him with everything she had brought to this, which was considerable, and the church was warm and the mountains were somewhere outside, and the whole of their lives stretched ahead. The reception was at the ranch, and Ruth and several women from town had conspired in its preparation, and there was dancing on the scrubbed kitchen floor that eventually moved to the barn where there was more room, and a fiddler named Pete Harlow who played with such energetic joy that even Tom Greer danced, which he later claimed had never happened. Henry danced with Winifred with the deliberate care of a man who dances competently but is very conscious of his hands, and she put her hands in his and his arms around her, and let the music carry them and laughed up at him and he laughed back, a full, unguarded laugh, the first one she had heard from him, and it was the best thing she had heard in her life. James fell asleep under a table and had to be carried to bed. Clara stayed up well past her bedtime and danced with Tom Greer with great dignity, and then fell asleep sitting up in a chair, still holding her dried flowers. The winter settled over the Sutton Creek Ranch with its full Wyoming weight. There were days of such cold that the world shrank to the distance between the house and the barn, and Winifred learned the particular intimacy of a life that turns inward together against the weather. She learned the way Henry moved through a storm, efficient and calm, securing and providing. She learned the sound of the house at 2 in the morning when the wind pressed against the walls and the children slept and the fire breathed. She learned, slowly and entirely, the person she had first reached through 4 pages of ink. He was not cold. He was the opposite of cold, once you had earned the interior of his attention. He was careful and steady and funny in the dry, underplayed way that she found herself listening for with the particular alertness of pleasure. He was capable of a gentleness that seemed at odds with his physical scale and the roughness of his working life. The way he touched Clara's hair when she was reading, the way he talked to his horses, the way he had left the best coffee cup for her every morning since the day she arrived. He was a man who expressed most of his feeling through action, and the rest through the occasional sentence that hit you precisely where you were not expecting it. He told her he loved her for the first time on a December night when a blizzard had pinned them indoors and the children were asleep, and they were sitting by the fire with her reading, and him mending harness leather with the focused attention he brought to all physical tasks. He said it in the middle of a silence, simply, without preamble, the way he had said most of his important things. She put her book down and looked at him for a moment and felt the whole winter and the whole journey and the whole long, strange, brave business of trust settle inside her. "I love you, Henry," she said. He nodded once, with finality, like a man who has confirmed something he was certain of but needed to hear. And then he went back to the harness and she went back to her book, and the fire burned and the blizzard screamed outside, and neither of them needed to say anything more because the room was full of it. Christmas at the Sutton Creek Ranch was the first real Christmas the place had seen in 3 years, and Winifred threw herself into it with the focused creativity of someone who has been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this occasion. She corresponded with Margaret Sutton in Cheyenne, who turned out to be wonderful, sharp and warm and capable, with Henry's direct manner and a great deal more demonstrated sentiment, and who wrote Winifred letters that were both welcoming and full of information about the family that Henry would never have thought to volunteer, and they conspired together on the matter of Christmas. There was a tree cut from the hillside above the south pasture, which James and Henry fetched on the wagon with great ceremony. There were ornaments made in the evenings at the kitchen table, with Clara producing geometrically precise paper stars and James producing enthusiastic shapes that defied classification. There was a goose for the dinner, prepared with Ruth's guidance over the course of a December morning that also involved considerable flour, and there were pies from Margaret's recipes, which Winifred executed with the satisfaction of a successful scientific experiment. Margaret came from Cheyenne for the week and proved to be exactly what her letters had promised. She and Winifred were friends within the first afternoon, with the ease of two people who recognize a kindred frankness. She took one long look at her brother on Christmas morning, at the way he sat at the head of the table watching his family with the settled, luminous expression of a man who has found his way back from somewhere dark, and excused herself to the porch for a moment, ostensibly for air, and Winifred followed her and found her standing with her eyes bright. "He hasn't looked like that since before Eleanor got sick," Margaret said, not as a grief, but as a joy. Winifred put her arm around Margaret's shoulders and they stood together in the cold blue morning, looking at the mountains. "I'm grateful for the advertisement," Winifred said. Margaret laughed. "He almost didn't place it. I had to write him 4 times. "He's stubborn," Winifred said. "Extraordinarily," Margaret agreed. "But once he's decided something, he's decided," Winifred said. "Yes," Margaret said, "he has." James came to the porch door and announced that Clara had claimed the largest piece of pie without consulting anyone and that he considered this a matter requiring adult intervention, and they went back inside to their family. The new year came and the winter deepened, and the ranch held its own, as ranches must, and Winifred's place in it became as natural and necessary as any other working part. She took over the household accounts, which she managed with the same organized intelligence she had brought to the bookshop, and found efficiencies that Henry acknowledged with the respectful attention of a man who does not have his pride in the wrong places. She continued James's reading advancement, which by February had progressed to the point where he was reading chapter books on his own at night, a development that filled both Henry and Winifred with a quiet shared pride that was one of the most domestic and ordinary and wonderful things she had ever felt. She went to Clara's horse lessons with the same earnest willingness that Clara found, she eventually admitted, difficult to resist. By March, Winifred could mount and ride a horse with something approaching competence, guided through this process by a 9-year-old teacher who took the role with absolute seriousness. Henry watched their first successful canter from the corral fence with his arms folded, and an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral about the fact that his daughter and his wife were laughing together in the cold spring air. In the spring, a situation arose that reminded everyone that the Wyoming Territory was still a place where hardship was not merely historical. There had been trouble with a group of cattle rustlers working the ranches east of Cutter's Creek for much of the winter, and in March they made a move on Sutton Creek Ranch, cutting fence and making off with a dozen head of cattle before Henry and Tom discovered it at dawn. The sheriff, a capable man named Wade Holloway, was summoned and conducted an investigation with the methodical patience of a man who had seen this before and knew how it was likely to resolve. It was not, in the end, a violent resolution. The rustlers were tracked to a draw 20 miles east, found by a posse of ranchers including Henry, arrested and held for trial in Laramie. No one was hurt. The cattle were recovered, but the days of Henry's absence with the posse were the first since her arrival that Winifred had been responsible for the ranch on her own, and she managed it with Ruth's help and Tom's on the first day before Tom rode with the posse, and then largely on her own for the 3 days following. She kept the livestock fed and watered, managed the children's routines, handled a minor crisis with a sick milk cow using Dr. Fielding's manual and her own best judgment, and met Henry at the gate when he rode back with the tired, dusty satisfaction of work completed, and he looked down at her from his horse and then dismounted and stood in front of her and said, "Everything all right?" "Everything's entirely all right," she said. He put his arms around her and held her there in the yard while his horse stood patient and tired behind him, and he didn't say anything but she felt him breathe. A long, slow breath that released something he'd been holding the whole 3 days, and she held him back and thought, "This is the man everyone said had no feeling left." By summer, Winifred was carrying their first child, which she told Henry on a July morning while they were standing in the kitchen before the rest of the house was awake, and which he received with an expression she had never seen on him, astonished and tender and struck through with something that looked like reverence. And he sat down heavily in the kitchen chair and stared at the table for a moment, and then looked up at her with his eyes very bright. "Are you well?" he said first, because Henry Sutton loved in the order of his concerns. "I am very well," she said. He stood back up and crossed the kitchen and put his hands on her face with a gentleness entirely at odds with their size and kissed her in the early light, and she put her hands over his and kissed him back, and they were very still together in the middle of their kitchen, in the middle of their life. Clara, who had appeared in the doorway at some point, said, "Is something happening?" Henry looked at his daughter over Winifred's head with eyes that were still bright, and he said, "We're going to have a baby." Clara's composed face underwent a complex series of negotiations between its various departments and settled on something that was, unmistakably, joy. "When?" she said. "February, most likely," Winifred said. James arrived half a minute behind his sister in the doorway, took in the room, took in his father's expression and Winifred's smile and Clara's unconcealed delight, and said, "What did I miss?" Clara told him with an efficiency that reflected well on her teachers. James's response was immediate and physical. He launched himself at Winifred in a hug that she received and returned fully, and over the top of his head she met Henry's eyes, and the look they exchanged was one of those looks that needed no translation, the kind that two people only have when they have built something real. The summer of 1879 on the Sutton Creek Ranch was the richest Winifred had known. The cattle were doing well, the range was green from good spring rains, and the household had found its fully settled rhythm. She was healthier than she had been in years, rounded and strong from the physical life, sleeping well in the clean Wyoming air, and she managed the pregnancy with the same practical determination she brought to everything, aided by Ruth's considerable experience on the subject and Dr. Fielding's careful attentions. Henry was attentive in the way that was characteristic of him, not demonstrative in public, not given to grand gestures, but entirely reliable in the way that matters most, which is to say that he was always exactly where he was supposed to be. He rode out every morning but came back earlier in the evenings. He carried things before she asked. He sat beside her in the evenings with her feet in his lap, reading his agricultural papers with a focus that was entirely unconvincing as indifference, because every few minutes he would look up and check on her with a look so unguarded in its love that she had to hide her smile in her book. Margaret came for a visit in August, and she and Winifred spent 2 weeks talking and walking and sitting on the porch in the long golden evenings, while Henry and Tom dealt with the endless inventory of summer ranch work. Margaret brought news from Cheyenne and opinions on everything, and a gift for the baby that she had made herself, a quilt in green and white, stitched with the kind of patience that is also a form of love. "You're exactly what I hoped for him," Margaret said one evening when the men were out at the barn and the children were in bed. Winifred was quiet for a moment. "He's what I hoped for," she said, which surprised me somewhat given that I wasn't entirely sure what I hoped for. Margaret looked at her sideways. "You wrote him 4 pages in your first letter. I think you knew something." "I knew I was tired of false presentations," Winifred said. "I didn't know it would lead here." "But it did," Margaret said. "It did," Winifred agreed, and looked out at the lit barn door where she could see Henry's shadow moving in the lamp glow, tall and unhurried, doing the work of the place they had made together. Tom Greer and Ruth came to supper twice a week as a matter of established custom, and those evenings had become something Winifred valued fiercely. The warm kitchen, the full table, Tom's dry humor and Ruth's practical warmth and Henry's quiet at the head of things and Clara and James woven through it all, growing visibly week by week into themselves. James was reading with a fluency that still made her proud every time she heard it, and Clara had begun writing up her horse observations with a seriousness that made Henry say, with considerable pride, that she might go to school properly one day and make something of it. She could be a naturalist, Winifred said. Henry considered this with the openness that had come to characterize his approach to his daughter's future, which was so different from what a girl of her time and place would generally be offered. "If she wants to be," he said. "Good," Winifred said. "That's the right answer." He smiled, the full, arrived smile that she had worked for and continued to feel the full force of, and said, "I've been coached by an expert." Fall came again, the anniversary of her arrival, and Winifred stood on the porch one September morning breathing the cool sage air and looked out over the ranch and thought about the woman who had sat in a bookshop in St. Louis 12 months ago and looked at an advertisement and made the terrifying, excellent decision. The mountains were the same. The sky was the same extraordinary Wyoming blue. The ranch was the same and entirely transformed, because it was full of life and noise and purpose and love in the daily, unremarkable, glorious way. Henry came up behind her and put his arms around her, his hands on the wide curve of her belly, and rested his chin on top of her head. They stood together in the morning light, and she felt the baby move a long, slow turn, like a fish in deep water, and she took his hands and held them there, and he made a low sound against her hair that was not quite a word. "Happy?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment, the way he was quiet when he was being very honest. "More than I knew how to expect," he said. She turned in his arms, which required some navigation at this stage of the proceeding, and looked up at him. "I have a question for you," she said. "Ask it," he said. "What would you have done if I had written a different kind of letter?" she said. "A polite, careful, demure letter, the kind you probably expected." He considered this seriously, which was one of the things she loved about him. He never dismissed a question. "I would have written a polite reply," he said, "and nothing would have happened." "So it was the 4 pages that did it," she said. "It was the 4 pages," he confirmed. "And the part about not wanting false pretenses," he paused. "And the part about being a fast learner," she laughed. "I have proven that." "You have proven that extraordinarily," he said, and the love in his voice was quiet and vast, the way good things in this country tended to be. February arrived with a storm that shut the ranch down for 3 days and then cleared to a brittle, perfect cold, and on the morning of the 14th their son was born. Dr. Fielding came in time, barely. Ruth was there. Henry was there, which he had refused to discuss the possibility of not being, and which Dr. Fielding had accommodated with the pragmatism of a frontier physician who has long since made his peace with the variable customs of the territory. The boy was healthy and large, with Henry's dark hair and Winifred's gray eyes, and he announced his opinions on the situation of the world with considerable volume from the first moment. Henry held him in the kitchen afterward while Winifred rested, and Dr. Fielding packed his bag, and Ruth moved quietly through the domestic aftermath of the event, and Clara and James stood one on each side of their father, watching their brother with the particular intensity of children encountering something momentous. "He's red," James observed. "Babies are often red," Clara said, with the authority of someone who had read this in a book. Henry was looking at his son with an expression that Winifred, watching from the doorway where she had appeared against everyone's practical advice, recognized as the same expression he had worn in December of last year by the fire, open, unguarded, struck through with feeling. She leaned in the doorframe and watched her husband hold their son, and his eyes came up and found hers across the kitchen, and the look between them was everything. The letters and the arrival and the porch evenings and the storm days and the dancing and the blizzard and the morning with his hands on her face and every ordinary sacred daily thing between all of those moments. "William," she said, because that was what they had agreed upon. "William," Henry said, trying the name on this small red person with great care. James nodded approvingly. "William Henry Sutton," he said, with the solemnity of someone who understands the significance of full names. That's a very good name." Clara reached out one careful finger and touched William's closed fist, and the baby's hand opened reflexively and closed around her finger, and Clara's composed face did something entirely undefended and joyful and completely her own, and she looked up at her father and then at Winifred and then back at her brother, and she smiled the whole way. The spring came, and with it the full reopening of the world after winter, and the ranch was in its finest season, the range greening up, and the cottonwoods putting out their new leaves, and the creek running full and cold from the snowmelt. William grew with the satisfying determination of a healthy child, becoming by May a person of definite opinions and considerable physical ambition, who had made it his project to investigate everything within reach. Winifred moved through this spring with a joy that was grounded and spacious, the joy of a woman who has found the life that fits her and is living it fully. She started a small library in the second bedroom. The ranch hands were permitted to borrow books, and several of them took her up on it with more enthusiasm than she had expected, including a young man named Ben Alcott who had arrived in the fall to help with the winter work, and who turned out to have an insatiable appetite for history that she fed from her 2 trunks with the pleasure of one who has found her proper calling. She wrote letters. She had never stopped writing letters. She wrote to Margaret regularly and at length. She wrote to Arthur Pell at the bookshop, which continued to thrive. She wrote to Mrs. Davenport of the post office, who replied with the comprehensive social intelligence of someone who processes all correspondence. She wrote occasionally to her mother, carefully and without rancor, keeping the lines open because she believed in open lines. And sometimes, in the evenings when the children were in bed and William was asleep, and the house had settled into its night breathing, she sat at the kitchen table and thought about the advertisement in the St. Louis Dispatch, 4 words that had aimed themselves at her across print and distance: "Seeks woman of sound character." She had written him everything true. And he had wept, reading it, and had folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket, and had spent that whole Wyoming evening at the window wondering what to do with the feeling she had left in him. And then he had sat down and written back. And from that correspondence, a whole world had been built, plank by plank and letter by letter and day by day. Henry came in from the barn one evening in May to find her sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp and a letter she was writing, William sleeping in the cradle nearby, and he stopped in the doorway for a moment before she heard him, watching her in the lamplight, and she looked up and saw his face. "What is it?" she said. He came in and sat across from her and folded his big hands on the table. "I was thinking," he said, "about the first letter." She set her pen down. "So was I," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I never told you completely," he said, "what it did to me." He paused and she waited the way she had learned to wait for Henry Sutton when he was working toward honesty, which was never far but sometimes needed space. He stopped, started again. "After Alina died, I was very sure that I had used up my particular allotment of whatever it was she and I had. Not as a self-pity, as a fact." His voice was quiet and precise. "And I placed that advertisement because Margaret wore me down and because I told myself it was a practical matter for the children. And then your letter arrived and I read it, and it was—" He stopped. "It was 4 pages of a complete stranger telling you exact true things," she said. "Yes," he said. "And something I had been quite certain was gone." He put his fist briefly against his sternum. "Was not." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand and held hers, the way he had held it through their entire wedding ceremony, with the same complete and serious attention. "I'm glad you cried," she said. He looked at her with a startled expression, and then the full, unhurried smile arrived, the one she would never stop finding wonderful. "That is a very unusual thing to say." "I mean it," she said. "It means you were still inside yourself, even when you thought you weren't. It means you were still there." He looked at their joined hands on the table for a moment and then at her. "You found that," he said. "You found it with a letter." "You found me too," she said. "You wrote back." From the cradle, William made a small sound of self-sufficient commentary, and they both looked at him, and then at each other, and the moment shifted from the deep and serious into the warm and domestic, which was the gift of a good life, that those two things lived so easily side by side. Henry went to William and lifted him with the practiced ease he had acquired over these months, settling the boy against his shoulder with the instinctive competence of a man who had done this before and loved doing it still. And William regarded the ceiling with the philosophical expression of a baby who has recently eaten and is at peace with the universe. "He has your eyes," Henry said. "He has your jaw," Winifred said. "God help him," Henry said, and she laughed. The summer of 1880 was a good one by any measure. The ranch turned a genuine profit for the first time in 4 years, which Henry attributed to the weather and Tom attributed to better management, which was diplomatically expressed and absolutely accurate. Clara turned 11 and spent her birthday conducting a comprehensive assessment of Silver's Gate that she recorded in her composition book with the thoroughness of a person who will one day write papers. James turned 9 and proved it by falling out of the cottonwood tree and breaking his arm, which he bore with the stoic patience of someone who knows the injury was worth the adventure, and which Winifred tended with the now considerable practical medical knowledge she had acquired from Dr. Fielding's manual and Ruth's experience. Henry and Tom expanded the south pasture fencing to accommodate a larger cattle operation, and Winifred rode out with them one morning to see the new work, William on her hip, managing the reins with the one-handed competence of a woman who had learned to ride while pregnant, and considered this adequate preparation for most situations. Henry watched her navigate the fence-lined terrain on his steady sorrel mare with a look of steady, grounded admiration, and Tom Greer, riding beside him, said without looking at him, "That there is a fine woman, Henry." "Yes," Henry said, with the conviction of someone stating a geographical fact about a mountain. In September, a letter arrived from Margaret announcing that she was engaged to a lawyer in Cheyenne named David Cross, and this news was received at the Sutton Creek Ranch with a celebration that involved the best bottle of whiskey Tom Greer had been saving for an occasion worthy of it. Margaret came in October with her intended, who was quiet and thoughtful and met Henry's careful assessment with the good-humored steadiness of a man who has done his research and was accordingly approved. David Cross, finding himself beside Winifred at the supper table, said, "Henry writes about you differently than he writes about everything else." "How does he write about everything else?" Winifred asked. "Facts and assessments," David said. "How he writes about you has other qualities." "He loves her," Margaret said from across the table with the undefended simplicity of a sister who is also a friend. Henry, who had heard all of this, said nothing but looked at Winifred from the head of the table with those steady gray eyes, and she looked back with everything she was, and the table between them was full of their family and their friends and their ordinary, extraordinary life. She was going to have another child by spring. She had told Henry 2 weeks ago, and he had sat on the porch in the October cold with her for a long time afterward, not talking, just holding her hand, which was its own form of eloquence. Margaret and David's wedding was in Cheyenne in the spring of 1881, a good clear April day, and the Sutton family made the trip by wagon and rail, William at 14 months running at constant speed and requiring the coordinated attentive efforts of 2 adults plus Clara, who managed this responsibility with the solemn efficiency of someone born for protective older sisterhood. James considered the train journey the highlight of the year so far and filed comprehensive mental notes on the locomotive machinery for future reference. Winifred stood up with Margaret at the wedding and watched her friend's face through the ceremony and thought about the letters that had brought all of them to this particular afternoon, the advertisement, the 4 pages, the careful reply, the correspondence that had crossed a territory and built a life. She thought about the woman she had been in the back of the St. Louis bookshop, frightened and direct and determined. And she thought about the woman she was now, standing in a Cheyenne church with a baby on her hip, and a husband in the front pew who was watching her with the open, settled love of a man who had come back to himself and knew it. Their second child, a boy they called Thomas Edgar Sutton Thomas for Tom Greer, who received this information by standing very still for an entirely uncharacteristic amount of time before producing the phrase, "Well now," in a somewhat compressed voice, and Edgar for Winifred's father, arrived in May of 1881 with considerably less drama than William's February entrance, as though having studied his brother's precedent and elected for efficiency. Thomas Edgar was from the beginning a different creature than William, quieter, watchful, with Winifred's dark hair and Henry's jaw, and an expression of general assessment that made both parents suspect they were being studied. William, now 15 months, received his brother with the focused scrutiny of a scientist encountering a variable in an experiment, and then went back to his primary occupation of attempting to touch everything. Clara was 12 that year and James 10, and the 4 children together in the Sutton Creek Ranch house was a warm and complicated and wonderful thing, and Winifred found herself sometimes just stopping in the middle of a task to stand and listen to the noise of it, the voices overlapping in different rooms, the sound of James reading aloud to William, Clara's patient instruction in something equine, the baby's commentary, Henry's voice somewhere in the house, steady and low. She thought sometimes about the things she had been told before she came cold and unfeeling, the neighbors said. A man of granite, carved by grief. She thought about the first evening on the porch when he had told her about weeping over her letter. She thought about the way he laughed now, which was still not frequent but was full and real when it arrived, and the way his face went entirely soft when he looked at William or Thomas in the morning, and the way he reached for her in the night, certain and warm. Cold. They had told her he was cold. She supposed that grief could look like cold to people who were not paying close enough attention, and that the difference between a frozen river and a river that was merely very deep was sometimes hard to determine from the bank. She had not approached him from the bank. She had jumped in with 4 pages of ink in good faith, and he had been there, warm and deep and real. By the fall of 1881, the Sutton Creek Ranch was a flourishing concern and a house full of life, and Winifred Townsend Sutton had become as essential to the land and the work and the community as anything else that had put down roots there. She served on the committee for the new Cutters Creek Schoolhouse, which was built that autumn and opened in November to 19 children, including James Sutton, and, to Clara's somewhat reluctant acknowledgement of practicality, herself, though Clara's education was supplemented at home by a correspondence with a natural historian in Laramie that Winifred had arranged through considerable letter-writing effort, and which Clara treated as the most important correspondence in the world. Winifred continued to run the small lending library in the second bedroom. She continued to manage the ranch accounts. She continued to read late, which Henry had made his peace with by the simple expedient of staying up to read beside her, which he would have said was a practical matter if anyone had asked, and which was love. On a November evening, 3 years to the month after her arrival on the stage from Laramie, they sat on the porch in the cold together the way they had sat through 3 years of evenings, and the stars were doing their vast Wyoming thing overhead, and the baby Thomas was asleep inside, and William was asleep inside, and James was asleep, and Clara was up in her room reading the latest letter from the naturalist in Laramie by lamplight. Henry had his arm around Winifred and she was leaning against his shoulder in the porch dark, and it was cold enough for their breath to show and neither of them was moving. "Do you remember what you wrote," Henry said, "in that first letter about not wanting to come under false pretenses?" "I remember the whole letter," she said. "It was a very good letter." "It was the best letter I ever read," he said. She smiled against his coat. "Even including your correspondence with the Livestock Commission." "Even including that," he said, with perfect gravity, and then the smile was in his voice, the dry, quiet humor that she had been listening for and finding for 3 years. "Particularly including that." She laughed and turned into him, and he held her in the cold, this big quiet man who had been waiting, without knowing it, for a woman who would write him 4 pages and mean every word of them. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I was frightened when I wrote that letter," she said. "Not of you, of the distance, of how completely I was committing to possibility, of what it might mean to hope for something real and have it not be." Henry was quiet, listening the way he listened, which was with his whole attention. "And I want you to know," she said, "that everything I hoped for was smaller than what happened." He tightened his arm around her. Outside, a coyote called in the dark, far away, and the stars burned, and the ranch was warm with sleeping children and the work and the life and all of it. "Same," Henry said. One word in the quiet voice, which was how he said his most important things, and which she understood completely. In the years that followed, the Sutton Creek Ranch continued to grow and to be shaped by the people in it. Tom and Ruth Greer grew into the settled companionship of people who have been together through the hard years and found themselves easier on the far side of them. Clara Sutton, at 14, began a formal correspondence with 2 naturalists in the East, and was told by one of them that her field observations were of genuine scientific interest, which she reported at dinner with the controlled composure of someone working very hard not to openly demonstrate how much this meant to her, while her father's face said everything she was not saying. And Winifred reached across the table and squeezed Clara's hand and said, "I am not even slightly surprised." And Clara looked at her with Aline's eyes and Winifred's direct, unflinching warmth and said, simply and entirely, "Thank you." James, at 12, had become a reader of such voracious appetite that Winifred wrote to Arthur Pell at the St. Louis bookshop twice yearly for supplies, and James was already talking about Laramie, about school, about what was farther. Henry listened to this with the equanimity of a man who had decided his children deserved the scope of their own ambition, which was a decision Winifred had participated in and was proud of. William, at 3, was a particular force of nature, combining Henry's physical confidence with Winifred's curiosity in a combination that required constant supervision and provided constant entertainment. And Thomas Edgar, at 2, had settled into the quiet, observant early self that everyone suspected would produce something interesting in time. They talked about another child occasionally, in the easy way of people who have the room for possibilities. They talked about building on to the south wing of the house to accommodate the library properly, which had outgrown its bedroom allocation with the enthusiastic support of half the ranch hands and most of the children in a 12-mile radius. They talked about Clara's education and whether Laramie or further east was the right kind of further. They talked, which was the thing. They had never stopped talking, the way they had always talked, directly and honestly, and with the full assumption of the other's interest and intelligence, the way Winifred had proposed in her first 4 pages of ink and Henry had answered with his careful pages back, and they had made a life of it. On a clear January morning in 1883, Henry came in from the early chores and found Winifred at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a letter she was writing, the winter light coming through the east window, and the house still quiet before the children woke. He poured himself a coffee and sat across from her and looked at her the way he had been looking at her since the first morning on this porch, with the full, attentive love of a man who chose the same thing every day and had never once regretted it. "Who are you writing to?" he said. She looked up. Her hair was undone still, dark and unruly, and her face was sleep-soft and entirely itself, gray eyes, no pretenses, all of her right there. "Margaret," she said. "She wrote asking about the children, and about you." "What will you tell her about me?" he said. Winifred considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Outside, the Wyoming winter was white and blue and relentlessly vast, and inside the kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee, and the wood fire was talking to itself in the stove. "I'll tell her you are the same man who wrote me that your letter was the most honest thing I'd read in 3 years, she said, "and that you have been consistent in that regard." "That's a generous report," he said. "It's an accurate one," she said. And then, with the directness that had been the beginning of everything, she said, "Henry, I would like you to know that I would write that first letter again, every word, every page." He set his coffee cup down. He looked at her across the kitchen table, across the lamp and the letter she was writing and the whole of the life between them. And his face was everything he was, the grief and the granite and the warmth and the humor and the love that had been there all along, waiting for someone to be honest enough to find it. "I would read it again," he said. "Every word." He reached across the table and she took his hand, the big rough hand that had held hers through their wedding and through every day since. And they sat together in the January morning, while the house began to wake around them. The sound of small feet, James's voice from upstairs, the baby's alert commentary from his cradle, Clara's door, and the whole living noise of everything they had made came into the kitchen with the light. Winifred squeezed his hand and picked up her pen, and Henry drank his coffee and watched the door for his children. And the ranch was alive outside in the winter, steady and ongoing and theirs. And the Wyoming sky was doing its enormous, improbable, brilliant thing above all of it, the way it always had, the way it always would. She had been told the widower was cold and unfeeling. She had found a man who wept reading her first letter, and had been moved enough by that weeping to write back, and had been brave enough, both of them, to keep writing until the words became a wagon ride, and the wagon ride became a kitchen table, and the kitchen table became a porch, and the porch became a life. Cold. She almost laughed when she thought of it now. She had found the warmest thing she had ever known, out here in the middle of the wide, cold West, and she had found it the only way such things are ever found, by telling the truth and trusting that the right person would hear it. She finished Margaret's letter as the kitchen filled with her family, and signed it with the name she had signed everything since November of 1878, with the same contentment and the same certainty, the signature of a woman who had arrived. Winifred Sutton. Sutton Creek Ranch, Wyoming Territory.